The An Lushan Rebellion in 8th century China was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Yet few people today have even heard of it. Led by the powerful general An Lushan, the rebellion was aimed at overthrowing the Tang dynasty. It plunged China into nearly a decade of chaos and destruction. The death toll is staggering, between 13 to 36 million people, over 15% of the world's population at the time. Famine and disease followed the conflict, wiping out entire villages and cities. So why is it so rarely mentioned? The Tang government deliberately downplayed the scale of the disaster to maintain political stability. Admitting to such a catastrophic failure could have weakened the dynasty's grip on power, so they buried the truth. This brutal conflict remains one of history's deadliest secrets. The Taiping Rebellion was a massive civil war in China that resulted in one of the highest death tolls in recorded history, yet most history books barely cover it. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, the rebellion sought to overthrow the ruling Qing dynasty and create a theocratic state. The conflict lasted over a decade and killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people. Starvation, disease, and mass executions wiped out entire regions. But why is it rarely discussed? The Qing dynasty and Western powers suppressed the truth to avoid destabilizing their fragile hold on China. Even the British and French, who aided the Qing, downplayed the true scale of the devastation to protect their colonial interests. The Taiping Rebellion was a human catastrophe and a carefully buried political disaster. King Leopold II's Congo Free State, 1885 to 1908. Belgium's exploitation of the Congo under King Leopold II is one of the most horrifying genocides in history, but it was deliberately hidden from the public for decades. Under Leopold's rule, the Congo was turned into a brutal labor camp. Villages were burned, families were torn apart, and those who resisted were mutilated or executed. The death toll? An estimated 8 to 10 million people, nearly half of the Congo's population. So why was it covered up? Leopold's regime controlled the flow of information, bribing journalists and diplomats to suppress reports of atrocities. Western governments, who had economic interest in the Congo's rubber and ivory, chose to stay silent. It wasn't until human rights activists like Mark Twain and E.D. Morel exposed the truth that the world began to see the full scale of the horror. Even then, many details were sanitized or omitted from official records. The Soviet famine and political purges, 1930s. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was responsible for some of the worst man-made famines and political purges in history, but the full extent of the devastation was hidden for decades. Stalin's policies, including forced collectivization and grain seizures, triggered the Holodomor famine in Ukraine, killing an estimated 7 to 10 million people. At the same time, Stalin's Great Purge saw millions more imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. Soviet propaganda blamed the famine on natural causes and internal sabotage, a calculated effort to deflect responsibility. Criticism was silenced through fear and violence. The true scale of the famine and purges remained hidden until Soviet archives were opened decades later. Even today, the legacy of Stalin's regime is debated, with the full truth still obscured by political narratives. The Partition of India, 1947. The partition of British India into India and Pakistan triggered one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Yet the true scale of the disaster was downplayed for political reasons. Over 14 million people were displaced as communal violence erupted between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. An estimated 1 to 2 million people were killed in massacres, riots, and forced migrations. Entire villages were wiped out, and countless families were torn apart. British authorities, desperate to exit their colonial responsibilities quickly, rushed the partition process without proper planning. The result was chaos. Both Indian and Pakistani governments later downplayed the humanitarian disaster to maintain national unity. The human cost of partition remains one of the most painful and underreported tragedies in modern history. The Rwandan Genocide, 1994. In just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people were slaughtered in Rwanda. Yet the international response was muted at best. The conflict erupted when Hutu extremists targeted the Tutsi minority in one of the most organized and brutal ethnic cleansings in modern history. Victims were executed in their homes, churches, and schools with machetes and firearms. Entire families were wiped out. But why was the world so silent? The United Nations and Western powers failed to intervene, claiming it was an internal conflict. Political interests and racial bias played a significant role in the inaction. The Rwandan government later downplayed the scale of the killings to maintain political control. Even today, the full truth behind the genocide remains a sensitive issue. The Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1917. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire carried out a systematic campaign to eliminate the Armenian population. Over 1.5 million Armenians were forced from their homes and marched to death camps in the Syrian desert. Many died from starvation, exhaustion, and mass executions. Entire Armenian communities were wiped out. But why is it rarely discussed? Turkey has consistently denied the genocide, and many Western governments avoided addressing it to maintain diplomatic ties with Turkey. The political pressure to silence the truth has kept the Armenian genocide out of mainstream history for over a century. The Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815. The Napoleonic Wars reshaped Europe and established France as a dominant military power. But the human cost was staggering. Over 3.5 to 6 million people died as a result of the conflict, including both military casualties and civilians affected by famine and disease. Napoleon's military campaigns were glorified in French history, focusing on his strategic brilliance and territorial conquests. But the devastation inflicted on the civilian population was rarely discussed. France's post-war governments downplayed the catastrophic toll to preserve the image of Napoleon as a national hero. The romanticized version of Napoleon as a military genius conveniently left out the suffering of millions. The legacy of the Napoleonic Wars remains one of both military glory and concealed human tragedy. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. The 30 Years' War devastated Central Europe, killing 8 million people through famine, disease, and violence. Entire regions were left uninhabitable, and cities were burned to the ground. The conflict started as a religious war, but quickly escalated into a power struggle between major European states. The death toll was staggering, yet historical records focused more on the political outcomes than the human cost. Governments and historians downplayed the devastation to frame the war's resolution, the Peace of Westphalia, as a diplomatic success. The immense human suffering was buried beneath political narratives of peace and power balance. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War, and for good reason. Over 3 million people died, including both soldiers and civilians. The conflict ended in a stalemate, with Korea divided along the 38th parallel, a division that remains to this day. Western powers treated the war as a geopolitical struggle between capitalism and communism, focusing on military strategy rather than human suffering. The civilian death toll was largely ignored in post-war narratives. The Korean War remains overshadowed by World War II and the Vietnam War. But for those who lived through it, the scars of the conflict are still fresh. The Indonesian mass killings, 1965 to 1966. Between 1965 and 1966, the Indonesian government carried out a brutal anti-communist purge that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people. Yet it remains one of the least discussed mass killings of the 20th century. The conflict began after a failed coup attempt, which was blamed on communist sympathizers. What followed was a coordinated extermination campaign led by the military, with support from Western governments, including the United States and Britain. Suspected communists, leftists, and even ethnic Chinese were rounded up, tortured, and executed without trial. Victims were buried in mass graves, and many families were left without answers. So why was it covered up? The Indonesian government portrayed the massacre as a necessary action to protect national security, and Western powers were complicit in the cover-up to prevent communist influence in Southeast Asia during the Cold War. Even today, the Indonesian government downplays the true scale of the violence, and survivors are still seeking justice. The Second Sudanese Civil War, 1983 to 2005. The Second Sudanese Civil War lasted over 20 years and claimed the lives of an estimated 2 million people, mostly civilians. The conflict began as a fight over religious and ethnic divisions between the Arab-dominated North and the largely Christian and animist South. Entire villages were burned, women and children were abducted, and famine and disease swept through the region as the fighting escalated. The Sudanese government used starvation as a weapon, cutting off food supplies to rebel-held areas. But why was it hidden from global attention? The Sudanese government controlled the media and restricted access to conflict zones. Meanwhile, Western powers were hesitant to intervene due to oil interests and political instability in the region. The humanitarian crisis was largely ignored until the conflict reached a boiling point in the early 2000s. Yet even after peace agreements were signed, the legacy of the war left deep scars on Sudan's population. The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. The Mexican Revolution was one of the bloodiest and most complex conflicts in North American history, yet its true scale is often overshadowed by the political changes it triggered. Over 1.5 million people were killed during a decade of civil war as revolutionary forces, government troops, and rival factions fought for control of Mexico. Mass executions, famine, and disease claimed the lives of countless civilians caught in the crossfire. The conflict eventually led to the rise of a constitutional government, but the human toll was devastating. So why was the bloodshed downplayed? The Mexican government and revolutionary leaders framed the conflict as a heroic struggle for freedom and justice. The brutal cost of that struggle, including the deaths of innocent civilians, was left out of official narratives to preserve the legacy of the revolution. Even today, Mexico celebrates the revolution as a symbol of national pride, while the darker human cost remains buried beneath political symbolism. The Paraguayan War, 1864 to 1870. The Paraguayan War, also known as the War of the Triple Alliance, was one of the deadliest conflicts in South American history, yet it's rarely discussed outside of the region. The war pitted Paraguay against the combined forces of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. Under the leadership of Francisco Solano Lopez, Paraguay's military launched an aggressive campaign, but the country was severely outnumbered. The conflict resulted in the deaths of between 300,000 to 500,000 people, nearly 70% of Paraguay's population, including women and children who were drafted into the military as the country's manpower was depleted. Entire towns and villages were left abandoned. So why was it hidden? The victorious nations of the Triple Alliance controlled the post-war narrative, portraying Paraguay's defeat as justified and minimizing the scale of civilian casualties. Meanwhile, Paraguay's government downplayed the destruction to rebuild national pride. The human cost of the Paraguayan War remains one of the most overlooked tragedies in South American history. The Ethiopian Civil War, 1974 to 1991. The Ethiopian Civil War lasted for nearly 2 decades, killing over 1.4 million people and displacing millions more. The conflict began when Marxist rebels overthrew the Ethiopian monarchy, leading to a brutal military dictatorship under the Derg regime. The government carried out mass executions, political purges, and forced relocations under the guise of maintaining order. The Red Terror campaign alone resulted in the deaths of an estimated 500,000 people, many of them tortured and executed in public. Famine followed as the government diverted food supplies to loyalist areas and withheld aid from opposition strongholds. The Ethiopian government tightly controlled media coverage and censored foreign journalists to prevent the outside world from witnessing the scale of the humanitarian crisis. Western powers were hesitant to intervene, seeing Ethiopia as a strategic ally during the Cold War. The full truth behind the Ethiopian Civil War was not revealed until after the fall of the Derg regime in the early 1990s. But even today, the memory of the conflict remains a sensitive subject in Ethiopia.